Donald Trump has managed to turn a negative into a positive. Right now, he is the victim. Right now, he is the victim of a government that's been politicized to attack its political opponents. His message, Carol, has been very compelling. He used this very effectively in Iowa, and this is the three sentences. Look what they're doing to me. If they could do this to me, imagine what they could do to you. Vote for me, and I'll make sure that doesn't happen. That has carried him extraordinarily well.
Why do you think Trump did so well in Iowa, exceeding expectations, really?
He didn't screw anything up too badly. I've often said, and in fact, I've told the president this many times, that the only person that could really beat him in election is himself. He managed to do that in 2020. He's managed to stay out of his own way so far in this very early days of this Republican primary. He did all the right things. He went all the right places, said all the right things, and essentially didn't screw up too badly, and had a crushing victory. There's a lot of discussion here, a lot of focus on whether or not he would eclipse the 50% mark, the outright majority of the folks who voted last night in Iowa. He could have won and would have won with 42%, but that would have given rise to the inevitable discussion about whether or not he had weaknesses and might be vulnerable. He won with about 52%, which puts a lot of that chatter to bed.
So what happens next? It's the New Hampshire primary next week. Presumably Donald Trump will be hoping to reinforce his position as the front runner.
Yeah, New Hampshire is next week. New Hampshire's interesting. Of course, Iowa's interesting. It's a caucus, not a primary, which is a uniquely American thing. It's a very public thing. People get together at the local gymnasium or the church or maybe somebody's house and talk about who they want to have for president, and in a fairly public way, they vote. In New Hampshire, it is a private thing. You go pull a lever in a booth like you do in a typical election, but unique to New Hampshire, non-Republicans can vote.
So that's the key difference, just for people listening who don't understand. There's a caucus last night in Iowa. That was just Republican voters who got to cast their votes. When New Hampshire comes, you have other voters who may not necessarily be Republican members who can vote.
So you're seeing, that's exactly right. And that's one of the reasons, in fact, the primary reason you're seeing a dramatically different polling landscape. So Donald Trump last night won by 30 points over both Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. He had about 50%. They had about 20%. Of course, DeSantis beat Nikki by a couple of percentage points. In New Hampshire, I've seen a couple polls that have Nikki Haley within 1 or 2 points of Donald Trump. Now, the more general average looks like she's down about 8, but that's a marked difference from being down by 30 in Iowa. Plus, Ron DeSantis is only polling at about 6% in New Hampshire. So it looks like a two-person race in that state. But again, that's colored by the fact that non-Republicans can and will vote, and they certainly are counted in the polling data.
So if Nikki Haley does well and comes up maybe a close second to Donald Trump, does that mean the race is on for the Republican nomination?
Maybe and maybe not. Again, because of the fact that Republicans can vote in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is sort of an outlier. It doesn't carry the weight as the next big state on the calendar, which is South Carolina. That is Nikki Haley's home state. It's my home state. She was my governor. We served together. One might expect her to do very well in her home state. So you envision a circumstance where she either comes in a close second or maybe squeaks out a win in New Hampshire and then gets to rush to her home state. The problem there is that she's currently down by 30 points in the polling against Donald Trump in her home state of South Carolina. So the short answer to your question is yes, it looks like it might be a race. But I ask you then, what happens when you get to your home state and you lose by 30 points? That's probably the end of that race.
So everything seems to point to another Donald Trump run at the White House.
I think that's probably fair. I think if you're going to see weaknesses in Trump's position, you would have seen it already. There are some folks, wondering whether or not some of his support might wither away if he's actually convicted of any of these criminal charges and if he actually goes to jail. But keep in mind, the calendar is his friend in that circumstance because he's likely to have enough delegates, which is what they're all fighting over, enough delegates to become the Republican nominee by the end of March. and there is no way that he'd be convicted of any of these crimes before the end of the March, and certainly would never be in jail by the end of March. So I think you're right. Donald Trump is more than likely going to be the Republican nominee again.
It does seem extraordinary, just looking at this from the UK, that he should be in that position, despite all these legal cases swirling around him. He's been in court, or another court case has been heard today. That was perhaps a less serious one. But before we get to that big Super Tuesday contest, when lots of different states all cast their votes on the same day, there is this potential case accusing him of trying to overturn the 2020 presidential election result.
Yeah, there is a chance that case would begin on Monday, March 4th. Tuesday, March 5th is the first of our several Super Tuesdays. I think there's 8 or 10 states that will hold their primary together on March 5th. So yes, the process will possibly start before people vote on March 5th, but there's no chance it will be concluded. So Donald Trump has managed to turn a negative into a positive. Right now, he is the victim. Right now, he is the victim of a government that's been politicized to attack its political opponents. His message, Carol, has been very compelling. He used this very effectively in Iowa, and this is the 3 sentences. Look what they're doing to me. If they could do this to me, imagine what they could do to you. Vote for me, and I'll make sure that doesn't happen. That has carried him extraordinarily well.
It is extraordinary how someone who is a multi-billionaire property tycoon at the center of all these court cases can somehow appear to align himself with the ordinary man, the ordinary voter.
I told him one time when I was sitting in the White House, he said something, and I looked at him and I said, "You are a billionaire man of the people." And I have no idea how you've done that, because I'm not sure anybody else has ever pulled that off. I'm never going to be either one of those things, and you're managing to be both. How do you do it? And he said that he didn't know, he just was, and he's absolutely right.
We were hearing a little bit of his victory speech last night, and he was sounding perhaps uncharacteristically conciliatory there. Do you think that he is going to be perhaps a bit more restrained, perhaps a bit less outspoken, or is it just that he's playing things cautious because he's out in front?
You know, it's a really good question, because I watched that speech last night and I was struck by it as well, because it's almost it's not, it's not typical for Trump to use that kind of language, but he was very conciliatory, very warm, very gracious. And that's not Donald Trump on the campaign. So I don't know if he was just tired, Carol. These things can go long, and they did. They called the race very early, but the speeches didn't come till much later in the evening. So maybe he was tired, maybe just looking to get forward to New Hampshire. Maybe he's turning over a new leaf. I don't think so. He's almost 80 years old now. I don't think you're going to change Donald Trump. Let's wait and see if that speech last night was an outlier or becomes part of a trend before we try and figure out what it means.
So if, as seems highly likely, he gets the Republican nomination, how do you think the battle against Joe Biden, round 2, is going to shape up?
I mean, right now, he'd probably win by 3 or 4 points. He'd win. Trump is leading in our. Keep in mind, again, for those who don't follow American politics as closely as you and I do, we don't elect presidents nationwide. We do it on a state by state basis, called the Electoral College system. So you look not to California, which is going to vote Democratic, and not to Texas, which is going to vote Republican, but you look to our swing states that could go back and forth between Democrat and Republican: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, Arizona, etc. Donald Trump is leading in every single one of those states against Joe Biden right now. So is Nikki Haley. So is Ron DeSantis against Joe Biden. But Donald Trump is beating Joe Biden in every single one of those states. There was some polling data out over the weekend that Joe Biden now has a 33% approval rating, which is the lowest approval rating of any president since George Bush at the depths of the global financial crisis. He has a real problem. Only 28% of the people polled believe he has the mental ability to do the job because of his age. That is a real problem for him, and I'm not sure how you fix it. I can change my policies on immigration. I can change my policies on energy production. I can't change the fact that I'm old and might no longer be at the top of my game.
And do you think that is the key factor, that those concerns of voters about his age and the fact that he does quite often, frankly, look a bit doddery?
Yeah, well, he's always looked doddery. He's always been a Gaff machine. That was sort of the joke about Joe Biden, who I think has run for president half a dozen times since the 1970s. That's not much of an exaggeration, by the way. But it has been more serious. He had a very high-profile press conference here almost a year ago now, where he asked for a member of Congress who he couldn't find in the crowd. Well, it turns out that member of Congress had died in a very public fashion in a terrible car accident about 10 days before. And Biden had actually spoken about that at one of her memorial services. So it's those types of things. It's no longer just gaffes. It's no longer, hey, it's really great to be here in Iowa when you're really in Indiana. That happens to everybody who speaks for a living. But when you're looking for dead people at a public meeting and you know that person has passed away, that's when folks start to scratch their head and go, oh my goodness, what's wrong here?
And when we do get to that, the head-to-head, if you like, between Biden and Donald Trump, if that's what it is, it's going to be a very different campaign from 2020, isn't it? Because that, of course, took place when we were on the shadow of the pandemic. Many events were cancelled, curtailed. There wasn't that much going out and about meeting the people. There weren't so many big rallies and so on. And it's going to have to be quite a different campaign this time around, isn't it?
It is a great question because you don't have the excuse to not campaign like both candidates did in 2020. But that being said, there's already discussion about there not being any presidential debates at all, none, which would be the first for us, I think, since 1960. That the Biden team doesn't want to really debate. The Trump team would love to debate Biden, but of course the Trump team did not engage in any debates in the Republican primary, and the Democrats are using that against Donald Trump now. In addition to that, the Republican National Committee has dropped out of the bipartisan presidential debate commission, which is the entity that typically is put on these debates. So there's a chance that you have a very different looking kind of campaign in 2024 than we've had in a long time. It won't be the same as 2020, and it certainly won't be for the same reasons, but it might not look like every other election for the past 50 years.
And finally, and just briefly, as a big question, will a Trump...
You'll have some of the same debates, the same wailing and gnashing of teeth as to whether or not we'll be pulling out of NATO or anything like that. But Trump 2.0 would be sort of very similar to the last year and a half of Trump 1.0.
Mick Mulvaney, former Chief of Staff to Donald Trump, really good to speak to you. Thanks so much.